know you heard me on the radio, flexing. She loved the sound of my voice, it's the best thing. Daydreaming of the jazz all day. Pick up the phone late night with Larry K. I know you heard me on the radio, flexing. She loved the sound of my voice, it's the best thing. Daydreaming of the jazz all day. Pick up the phone late night with Larry K.
Night Watch listeners, Rutgers fans, it's been a minute. I've been busy. The summer is now in full swing. We are not only post-Memorial Day weekend, but we are in the official summer solstice season. So it's hot out there. It's a heat wave, and we're deep in the off season. Football is creeping up ever so slowly, but you know how that month of July and late June go before we get to training camp. We have to bring you some sort of interesting content, and I hope you've been enjoying the specials that David Anderson and I have been giving you. I know you have, based on the commentary, the listenership, etc. Remember, if you want to stay updated on what we're releasing, click that subscribe button right here. Join us on the YouTube channel, and you can also become a member now. You can get some exclusive perks by subscribing to the channel and supporting what we do. So take a look at join, that join button right here. Throw a little bit of sponsorship our way, and it's appreciated. But today we're going to shift gears a little bit. We talked a lot about the football program and Coach Schiano. We've discussed embracing the future of college athletics. But how, if at all, has that changing landscape affected another individual, somebody who really has been through a lot of controversy and ups and downs in this school? And I know there's an AD search underway. I know we got a new president, and I want to address you about that. I'll have a separate standalone little blurb on that. I think there's a lot to like about the president we have coming in. But I want to talk about Steve Pikiell. And Dave kind of reached out and said, hey, we can do this Embracing Part 3, or we could talk about Steve Pikiell. And I said, let's talk Pike, because this was a guy who came in, so much fanfare, built the whole thing, so much hype up to what we thought would be the pinnacle. And now we are where we are. So, Mr. Anderson, welcome back to Night Watch once again. It's an absolute pleasure to get you on the air and talk to the people. How are you?
I'm doing all right. How about yourself?
Pretty darn good. It's a little hot, but I got the air on. I'm surviving. First of all, I know we didn't say we would talk about this, but any thoughts on the new president or the AD search other than what we've already kind of covered?
I think that Rutgers has been so ridden with scandal, especially on the athletic department side, that they were trying to just make a power move of someone who has a solid track record. I can't speak as much to the academics. Obviously, I wasn't a student like a lot of the other commentators were. I can't talk about the ins and outs of that. But it just seems like they need someone with leadership abilities who has a proven track record at a high level. And from that standpoint, I think that was the move that had to be made. I know Holloway didn't have problems like that, but your whole university is tarnished when you have all these problems, especially most recently with Pat Hobbs. And so I think overall, I had no negative thoughts about it, unless, you want to dig into the weeds from an academic standpoint.
No, I mean, look, and I was a student, two schools, obviously undergrad and then law school. And I think it's a good hire. I know Holloway came from, a strong academic background, but he also lent himself to athletics and cared about them. I think that's going forward has to be part of the considerations. We're a Big Ten university now. It's ingrained in the fabric, not just athletics, but other, research, academics, all those things. I think this was a really good hire. I think he's going to do well for athletics. He comes from a school that was obviously had a lot of pride in their athletic system. But I also think just because there's a generalized, blurb that, it's not the most prestigious academic institution ever, it's not an Ivy, maybe he's not great for academics. I think that's misplaced in a categorical kind of thing that is not necessarily based in reality. So I actually think it's a great hire if you're an athletics fan, and I think it's more than on solid footing for academics and research. And I think it's the right the right guy to captain a ship of this size, this large state institution with all these moving parts. Athletics is one small part of it. Research is a large part of it. And then academics, another part of it, all these schools. He's the guy who's captained a ship like this before. And, albeit we have to delve into the weeds with how he did and what the differences are. I think it's just suffice to say a good hire. I'm excited about it. Excited about, what's going to happen with this athletic department. We're going to have plenty to talk to about that. But speaking of the athletics department, we've talked a lot about the football program at Schiano. We've touched on basketball when we're discussing, embracing the future of college athletics. But I think something, especially that, I've been pondering, honestly, between you and I and between all our listeners now, how going forward, I'm going to cover our basketball program. Because when this podcast started, it was definitely a joint basketball football podcast. And to be honest with you, I kind of made my bones and bread and butter with basketball on this channel because basketball was really kind of on an upswing to the point where some people were saying, oh, Rutgers is now going to be a basketball school.
Right.
Those dark days of football and when it was kind of on a slight ascension with Schiano in the early days of his second tenure. And there was a lot of hype. There was a lot of buildup. I think everybody thought Steve Pikiell was on absolutely solid ground when we had the, Geo Bakers and Caleb McConnells and Ron Harper Jr.'s of the world playing ball here. You get Cliff coming in and maybe he wasn't what some people had ridiculously hyped him to be, but he was a very solid player for us. And it was a good recruiting get. And he developed all these other guys. And now I've been pondering, how am I going to cover it going forward? Because being honest, I'm not saying I can't from a journalistic perspective do it, but this is a fan/journalist podcast here. And I've seen the recruiting visits come in. I've seen some analyses. I've seen some debates. And I got to be honest with you, I'm not as engaged. I'm not as enthusiastic right now about the basketball program, not just based on last year. And I think what the hype was and what it could have been and what it turned out to be, but even the year before that. And just the fact that I feel like we're on a runaway train that may have gained enough speed and momentum to glide down the tracks for, an indeterminate amount of time, but doesn't know how it's going to refuel, doesn't know how it's going to keep going, doesn't know where its destination is. And I'm really feeling like I'm not sure where this basketball program is going under the current leadership. So I'm trying to rebuild my enthusiasm if I can, and also look at this thing like what on earth happened from this build to, you always think, well, if we build enough, we'll get the high level recruits. Once we get the high level recruits, we hit that next gear and it keeps going. We win more. And once we win more, we get more high level recruit. And we hit the absolute jackpot pinnacle of recruiting and we got worse, it seemed like. And I got a lot of ideas of the reasons for that. We'll talk about it. But I wanted to kick it to you. You could start at the beginning of the tenure, the famous TikTok diner meeting with Hobbs. You could talk about mid-tier when Geo leaves. You could talk about the changing landscape. You could talk about last year. Start wherever you want. We're going to cover it all. Talk to me about the state of this basketball program and head coach Steve Pikiell driving this ship.
Well, I think two things jump out at me. One, well, first of all, I've joined, Aaron's podcast is Scarlet Faithful, but he doesn't even let me talk basketball a lot of times because I get too emotional and upset about it because I've been more of a Rutgers basketball fan probably until about 2011 than I even was a Rutgers football fan. So, I mean, when you look back, there's two things I think, like I said, that jump out. One, Rutgers had somewhat success with going the route of taking more of a program builder type in there. So from my time as a fan, you went the Kevin Bennett approach, who had success at Rider. You went with Gary Waters, and then you kind of went the opposite approach with more of a recruiter type in Fred Hill. Didn't really work out as much because you didn't know if he could coach. So you go back and you get Mike Rice, who again could coach at a lower level. And then you kind of go back to the well for a 4th out of 5 hires in a sense of, hey, let's take someone who has a proven record as a coach and at least see if they can translate it to a better level with better resources. And I think basketball, when you look at most programs, that is generally the model that has worked more effectively at the top level. So I think in that sense, it was the right move. I thought I wouldn't have called Pikiell a home run hire when he was made, but it was pretty good. I thought that, this is at least a double. Like I didn't have red flags really in any way from what he was doing. And when you talk about his track record of or knowledge of coming from the Big East as someone came from UConn, yeah, I always felt the Big Ten had a higher floor as a conference, but there was a reason the Big East was winning titles and the Big Ten wasn't. And I was hoping that he could kind of come in with both sides of that and kind of see, okay, this is where there's an avenue for, if everyone else is zigging, this is where we zag. And one of the ways that they did that was finding these like gritty type defensive guys, which is what you need to survive in the Big Ten, but then come up with a little bit of their own flavor. Now, when Rutgers peaked in the 2022 season, and this kind of goes to a point we made on one of the other football episodes, is like you start to lose the guys who helped you build the house. And the guys who come in after the success has been achieved don't have the same chip on their shoulder, don't have the same thing to prove, and you can't catch that lightning in a bottle twice. Now, we may semi be able to do it again because Rutgers is sort of going down. So there might be some guys who come and want to be the solution, not the, just ride the wave like you were kind of talking about. Like this train is already on the tracks. But that's where I think he was a good hire in the first place. And obviously what he did was quite impressive. And we can get a little bit more into exactly how that was. But I'm kind of with you. I'm not sure if what made the program a success to reach that multiple NCAA tournaments in a row is able to be reproduced again in the changing college landscape. So really it's those two things. One, I think you have to have someone who can coach. Just getting someone who can recruit is not going to work unless you're, Duke and every guy is a 5-star. So it's the right type of coach, but then at the same time, I'm not sure how their strategy will work in the changing college landscape. And that's what we'll hope to explore in the next 30 to 40 minutes.
Yeah, and I think, look, what I think really happened, and I've said it here, I've said it on this show, we've said it when we kind of talked a little bit about, the current state of it, and I'll reiterate my position. I think his coaching strategy and the way he does it with guys that are developmental at root and display that grit, who are willing to learn, and then individually coaching them on his defensive, strategies and philosophies and tactics, and then coaching them up as a team once they've learned those fundamentals to develop into a defensive kind of force. It was really effective when you had to sit 1 year when you transferred. It was really effective when you built a team of guys primarily that stayed for 3 and 4 years. And we realized the fruits of his labor when we peaked with these guys who came in, and some of them just on their natural abilities on the offensive side. But let's not get it twisted, right? Geo Baker, Ron Harper Jr., forces on the offensive side of the ball, but there were inconsistencies even with them sometimes where we were shaking our heads. We tend to paint it all as rosy looking back, and it was good enough, based on our pinnacle of success there for us anyway. But there were still inconsistencies on the offensive side of the ball because Pikiell's a defensive coach. And I think my read of this is the college landscape rapidly changed in terms of guys coming in for 1 year, max 2, guys leaving 1 year, not having to sit out, guys getting paid, all those things. But I think on a more substantive level, what changed is you lose that time to develop guys defensively. And I think specifically with Pikiell, it seemed like right when Ace Bailey committed is when I think I realized that this changed, and I really lost faith in him a bit. It seemed to me like when Ace Bailey signed on, all of a sudden the next year, Pikiell's entire philosophy, it was like he was trying to gain up enough speed to take off on the runway. And I thought that was the right approach, but the way he wasn't. Well, now we got to be just super fast paced, offensive juggernaut, get nothing but shooters, nothing but run the floor, nothing but toss up threes. But the thing was, the guys he brought in that year to do all that he talked up all offseason really weren't able to do it. Offense was still anemic. There was still no real core offensive philosophy, but we kind of abandoned somewhat that identity of grit, play that tough D, be able to implement those strategies. And it was bad 2 years ago. And then when these guys came in, it was like, well, who cares? I felt like there was some, and you saw it in some of the commentary out in the media sphere, but I wonder if that affected the coaching or vice versa, or if it was just like this back and forth energy exchange, or was just ubiquitous within Rutgers basketball. But it was like, hey, we got these two guys. These two guys are superstars. So don't worry about, the defense coaching up. Don't worry about, offensive philosophy. I mean, these guys are going to get the ball. Magical things are going to happen. And sometimes, especially when, Dylan was healthy, magical things happen. But relying on two kids, not having the defensive backbone that got them there, not being able to coach guys up over time to develop that. Now, Ace and Dylan come in for 3 years. I think we know it's a whole different conversation, not happening. But I just wonder if we built up to a point where we get these premier recruits, but once we get them, they just want to run around and create. They just want to have the ball in their hands and play offense. Pike says, well, whatever they want, they got. It's going to be magical. And he kind of just, that meme where the guy throws up his hands and the papers fly everywhere. I might have referenced this before, but that's like literally what I think. It was just like, whatever, like my whole defensive 4-year plan is not going to happen here. I got these big names. I'm just going to throw them out there. It looked like that to me, whether he intended that or not. And I just feel like now, without that ability to develop guys defensively over 3 years minimum, I don't know if he knows how to do it. And let's forget the money and all that.
Right.
That's just on the floor, Dave. That's my read of what kind of happened here. He developed those first guys. Then he just said, well, hey, we got great guys. We don't have to do it. And it fell apart. That's my read.
I think I'll temper that slightly, but I wouldn't say I fundamentally disagree. I think that there's a little bit of poor self-scouting as to what made the success of those earlier teams. And that's where, someone like Aaron or someone like yourself, or a lot of the podcasts this offseason, I've been trying to say, what made the Pikiell defense work with these other guys who, again, were imperfect offensive players. I mean, you look at their points per game. You talk about Ron, Gio, even Jacob Young, like they still weren't averaging that many points per game. And it was really the defense. And how did that defense work? Well, they had lengthy, positionless basketball guys in the middle of the defense. And then the back of the defense, you had rim protection. And when I look at this past season, the very early on, Pikiell said at that one press conference, I want to press and I want to use Ace Bailey in the front of the press, which I think was right, because I do think that if you can't coach guys to play 30-second defensive basketball on the shot clock, you're better off trying to coach them for 15, 20 seconds. So how do you do that? You press. Now, in my high school team, where I was, as many of the listeners might know, I was actually co-captain of my high school basketball team with former Rutgers defensive coordinator Joe Harris-Simiak. We played basketball together. And defensively, our coaches played a different press each year, depending on personnel. So, like, if you have a lot of big guys, then you might play a zone 3/4 court press, and you only trap in very specific places. But then if you have the smaller athletes, then you play full court man-to-man pressure, which that's not what Rutgers had. But they easily, if you have Ace Bailey as your 3 or 4 man, and you can play him in the front, you would have been able to kind of just slow teams down from just coming down court. The problem was they had no one who they could trust in the back to prevent teams from just dunking or getting easy 2-on-1s, which means you have to back off of that. And I don't think they really had the personnel to then play Ace in the back, because there was no one else necessarily to play in the front. And so you end up in this thing where there's, okay, plan A doesn't work, so you're thinking about plan B, but then plan B can't work, so now you're on plan C, and you end up in a similar situation of football where you're like, okay, what can we do? And I don't think basketball ever had that moment like football did at that second bye to be like, okay, what can we do with what we have? And I don't know if the team necessarily would have bought in, even if the coaching staff came with that. But I think that they kind of had an idea of like, okay, we can modify our system a little bit. But once that didn't work, there was no plan C. There was no other alternative.
And let me drill into, because I think this is excellent. I want to drill into what you're saying. Do you think that this was a strategy that they had a while to they thought this for a while that they were going to implement given the personnel they expected to have? Or do you think some of the failures maybe in the transfer portal or some of the guys leaving, forced this? Like, how abrupt do you think this philosophy was, whether it worked or not? Do you think this is something that they had drawn up and known for a while? This is what we're going to go with this personnel. Do you think they were already abruptly forced into that press situation and then it didn't work and then the wheels really came off? Because I think those are two separate things as far as
I think that they didn't realize how important a rim protector was and that they needed to overpay for it. And maybe there was a hope that you could get Cliff to stay, or there was a hope. I think the market slid on them faster than they were ready. And this is kind of where we talk about the GM hire. A person like in the football program, they've been ahead of what the changes are coming. Basketball is always behind. So they didn't see what the price of a rim protector was going to be, because if they did, they would have realized we might as well just pay for Cliff. All of the money we have would have been a better solution, because the price for an average rim protector was 3/4 of that. And then they thought, okay, we can get somebody else who might be able to protect the rim. And they knew Lathan Somerville wasn't going to be able to as a freshman. So that and I don't think they thought Agbole was that guy either. Maybe they thought he could be their second or third center. But from everything they said, they realized they wanted Agbole as a third guy, Somerville as a second guy, and they need a rim protector. And in retrospect, the mistake was you should have just paid Cliff, or you had to overpay for a second tier guy, which again would have been almost the same price. And if you put them, gun to their head and say, where did the biggest mistake you made? That's it. Because if you just had Cliff and Dylan and Ace, you could have gotten by, I think. But when you don't have a rim protector, and then your backup, like you've always had during this Pikiell era, is if your rim protector's out, or you have you have to use Mo Dokor or Shaq Carter, who's not really a rim protector, but they can get some rebounds, and there's the bigger guy, then you need these long wing types to kind of just shrink passing lanes as the other approach. But they had neither. And then that's where they're in trouble. So it was poor self-scouting to realize we have neither, and that we really needed a rim protector, which they never got. And so I think that's really, if you want to drill into it, those two things happen simultaneously. Whereas when they were kind of thinking of this 2 years ago, like you said, it was like, well, we'll have one or the other. And they ended up with neither. I mean,
right.
Griffiths transfers, and then PJ Hayes is not playable. Like, you don't end up with enough of those long defenders to kind of make up for it.
And I think it's interesting, and I'm wondering now, the money that could have been allotted, and it could have been a little more if you just gave it all up for Cliff, but they allotted all this money through several different guys that they brought in, and each guy, and even I was excited about them. Well, look at all these offensive skill sets that you could plug and play at all different parts of the court, at all different situational, for all different situations. None of those guys, almost any of them, and I know there was an injury, it's unfortunate, but none of these guys really panned out to be any kind of formidable, super powerful thing. Martini and Hayes are non-factors, basically, supposed to be sharpshooters. And I wonder how much of that was principle, like, we're just not paying Cliff that much money, we're just not doing it. How much of that was, well, we're switching philosophies and we're going to emphasize offensive firepower that we think we're going to get? Or how much of it was, mutually parting of the ways with Cliff? I kind of felt like it's time for a scenery change. He's just gone. Therefore, we've got to pivot. Or we think we can replace him or keep him. And now that we can't, we're going to spread it out on offense, as an alternative plan to the defense. I'm really curious, because I think it says a lot about the way that Steve, his philosophy is going to be going forward, and whether there was a blunder here and where it was, whether it was happenstance or whether it was a strategic problem, with what happened here. Because I'm just curious. They spent a lot of money on these guys who were not as effective. And like you said, they let a Cliff walk who would have been a huge asset. Now, feel free to comment on that, but I want to just, where do they go from here as far as defensive philosophy? I understand, okay, with these personnel, we're going to try to press, and we might have the personnel to make it work. Doesn't work. In the early iterations of Pike, there was this buildup. You always had a rim protector. You had Miles, you had Cliff, and you had gritty defenders, and a guy like Caleb McConnell, who didn't necessarily come in as a premier defender, became the premier defender, the quote unquote, glue guy. And then you have other guys coming through the system who could have been the glue guys, and then they wind up leaving or not panning out or whatever it is. But those were philosophies that were built up over, several years. So, like Mag, that guy was, I thought, and a lot of people thought, the upcoming glue guy. And before the injury, I think you would argue he was, and then he's not all of a sudden. And then he leaves, and then his heart's not in it. Going forward, you've got to develop or recruit a rim protector and that defensive juggernaut glue guy, and everybody else also has to buy in. Geo Baker and them bought in, and the role players bought in, even though you had McConnell maybe on the best player and you had the rim protector. Is there a way for them to get these guys for 1 year, max 2 year rentals? Or is that whole system out the window because it relies on developing those two pivotal, cornerstones of this team? And it's just not a possibility in today's climate. And if so, where do they go?
Is it doable? Yes. Is it going to be hard? Yes. My thought is Rutgers isn't the only defense first team in the NCAA, right? So if your issue is you need guys to know defensive principles, what's stopping you from getting a cheaper option from a lower program who can understand some of those principles? The answer to that is supply and demand, in my opinion.
Right.
Because the chances of finding a Mo Mag at Stony Brook or Albany or, BU or whatever, like that, then the North, I'm just throwing Northeast programs out there, Monmouth, let's say we just NJIT, wherever, that is willing to step up is not high. The number of the guys who are 6'7", they're going to be taking the money and going to a bigger program. So, and then they're probably not going to learn the defensive principles if they're, the 13th or 14th man at UCLA or whatever, right? So I think that's difficult. But you don't need every single guy to be in that mold. But you are going to need to find it, to your point. I think you're going to need to have a Caleb Mag type and a rim protector. You're going to need both because you're going to need double coverage, basically, right? And I think you're going to have to roll the dice with, like, in this class, you have Caden Powers. He's only about 6'5". He's not as big as Caleb or Mag, right? But he's probably not commanding a lot of money. And he's probably not going to be poached because he might not play that much the first year. So like a guy, but he plays the 4 on his team in high school. So I think that mindset is right. You might try to roll the dice with a Caden Powers type every year, knowing he's less likely to get poached, might not take the money, and you might be able to develop him. Well, simultaneously, you need a GM or somebody who's like an encyclopedia of basketball, especially in the Northeast, to be like, who's available? Even if they're on a Penn, a Princeton, whoever, that like they can be one of those wing guys. The big guy is harder. I think you're going to just have to pay for it. That's my opinion. Because Ware, who's coming in this class, he's unless he totally changes, he's not his type, right? So you're going to have to pay for the big guy. But I think you're going to have to play Moneyball there. And then this is where we kind of touch on it in one of the Embracing the Future of College Athletics podcasts, is like finding the 6'2" Tyson Acuff guy who can score points, especially with the second unit. Those guys should be easy to find. And I never understood why Rutgers couldn't find them for the last 20 years. And now we've had a couple. We've had Jacob Young. Mm-hmm. We've had, to a lesser extent, Acuff. Even a Geo Baker is kind of like a combo guard. Right? He's not really a point guard, but he can score if you need him to score. Right. And so that's where the Tariq Francis type of thing, like if he's the third guy in your team in that role, fine. Like you can try to grab a couple of those guys and say, okay, even if these other guys can't score, we have someone who can put the biscuit in the basket if we're running this pressing unit and we need to steal a couple minutes with 4 defensive-minded guys and 1 ball-dominant player. And so I think that's how you're going to have to do it. So I think it's doable, but they're going to have to develop relationships with other programs that, yeah, they're not going to want to surrender their defensive-minded guys either. Nobody wants that. But if they can kind of figure out this feeder system, and I think this is going to be short-lived because when we talk about the future of college athletics, I think ultimately we're going to reach the club model. And in effect, Rutgers or whatever the New Jersey team is going to have almost like a development program where they can do these fundamentals, more or less. But until that point, you're going to have to come up with a way to identify players who have these individual defensive skills. So you're skipping ahead to basically year 3 under the Pikiell old system with a guy who already has some of those fundamentals. And nobody that came in on this most recent team, except for maybe Martini and Acuff, though he was physically limited, had any semblance of a clue of what the heck they were doing on the defensive end. And so, you know, Ace and Dylan's physical gifts can help them on the defensive end somewhat, but unless they're mixed and matched with other guys who have that defensive, I mean, Jermichael Davis is probably the only plus defender at best on the team, right? And even then, he's not like a superstar. Like, you're going to have to fit those pieces together kind of in a Moneyball sense. And I do think there's ways to do it, but it's really going to be tough because all of these things are going to have to break right.
Yeah, I think it's going to be tough. You're going to have to thread the needle on it. And my other question is, okay, I mean, I think what you're not per se saying this, but it seems like, you know, you're operating from now a perspective where Rutgers is saying, and I think they should if they're going to keep this coach. I think there's no way around it, but they're saying, well, we are a defense-first team. We're a defensive team. We're going to put a strong emphasis on recruiting defensively, fundamentally sound players. But I would ask you, too, I mean, you get a guy, and I don't even know how it happens, but I think it was a huge catalyst, and I think it's a missed opportunity that the team didn't do more with him. But you get a Cam Spencer, who was an offensive force, but also played good defense. And I mean,
Right.
his steals, and it was evident early on. And that was a two-way guy. And I don't even know how he stumbled on him. I know he's at a lower level, and he kind of passes us, thanks, through the terminal and heads on up to UConn and does, you know, special things. But it's like, what of when you put so much emphasis on defense in this world of college ball where guys come and they go? We have seen now Eugene Omoruyi, Cliff. I think a big part of his leaving was to learn that offensive side of the ball better. The guys want to play offense. Jacob Young, you know, for his last year, moves on. Cam Spencer moves on, and you hear mumblings and murmurs. And I think some of that, I'm not a beat reporter. I'm not in there all the time. I don't have guys that constantly call me with internal, you know, information, but it didn't seem like it was per se interpersonal, other than maybe, you know, the Paul Mulcahy situation. Maybe he wore out his welcome a little and vice versa. But the other ones didn't seem like it was so interpersonal as much as they're not getting the offensive side of the ball coaching here. They're not becoming as well-rounded as they want to be. And they move on where they think they're learning the other side of the ball. Are there guys out there who, whether they're great at defense or not, do they want to emphasize that? Is that their ticket? Like, hey, this is a defense team. This is my skill set. I'm going to maximize it. Or are they more interested in learning the offensive side of the ball? And I guess, is there a void there? Because you made the comment, you know, that getting these defensive guys is going to be difficult because you're in a bidding war. I mean, other teams, maybe they want to pluck two of those guys to go with their offensive juggernauts, and that's smart. If Rutgers is saying we're emphasizing defense first and foremost, you know, how does that affect their ability to go out and get guys and plug that up? And the other one last thing I'll say is, like, some of the problem is, like, we also get guys that are supposed to be these great shooters and these great offensive, you know, facilitators, and to some extent they improve Rutgers, but they get here and all of a sudden they can't shoot threes. All of a sudden they can't. And I think that has something to do. Some of it's bad luck. Some of it has got to do with offensive philosophy and strategy and the inability to get guys in positions to succeed. You can't convince me that it's all bad luck and just cold streaks. But your thoughts on that stuff?
There's a lot of things to say about that. I mean, I think, like, the Gavin Griffith situation is kind of perplexing to me because he didn't even succeed at Nebraska. So you're saying he wasn't even playable for Nebraska down the stretch this year. So obviously that, I think, is a little bit of bad luck. You're taking a top 50 guy, more or less, or top 100, whatever he turned out to be after his eye injury in high school. But so I don't think it ultimately would have worked out. However, you had no one else who can shoot 2 years ago. No one. Did they ever run plays, screens, get him open? No. It wasn't until late this year that you saw Martini getting it a little bit. But even then, I think a lot of that was just the gravity of Dylan and Ace.
Mm-hmm.
PJ Hayes, I'm not sure if he just wasn't tall enough or not, because you look back at some of the shooters that they've got, like Issa Chom, right? This guy's 6'10". It's not like you have to worry about hands in his face. He's going to get the shot up because he's tall, right? But Peter Kiss never got him shots. And then look at how he did after he left. I mean, if you could have just set screen, and that's where this is the biggest argument I have with all Rutgers fans. I'll be like, they don't run offense. And other people will point to examples of, hey, they ran offense in this play. So it's like, okay, sort of. And then you say, okay, is that because the coaches aren't teaching offense, or players aren't just refusing to run the offense? And then you end up running, the high screen and roll with 10 seconds on a shot clock, Jacob Young style every time. And it's like, even with Gio and Ron and all those guys, they didn't run enough offense a lot of times. And my biggest thing is Caleb never really improved offensively. He was better as an offensive player his freshman year when he was able to play point guard and distribute the ball. He wasn't even able to do that later on. He actually regressed from an offensive standpoint. He scored more points because he got a little better with teardrops and stuff like that. Montez Mathis never improved on offense. Ron Harper improved a little bit, but that might have just been growing into his body. Gio improved slightly. And so Paul didn't really improve. He was just his 3-point shooting improved slightly, which made him more effective. But if you look at all those guys, I think you're straight on point that they need an overhaul offensively. And that's not to say it's at the demise of defense. I'm not saying you need to re-emphasize offense more. I'm saying you need to go back to the drawing board with your offensive philosophy entirely, because it's not working. And guys are going to continue to leave because they're not seeing themselves getting any better. I think that is a major problem. And I think I'm focused on the defense with this Moneyball type of thing, because what you saw at the end of this past season was it didn't matter what you could do on offense, because against Iowa in the ultimately fateful game that may have sealed the season, you couldn't stop anything against like the worst road team in the conference. So that's why I think I'm focused more on defense. But yes, I 100% agree with you. Players are leaving because they're not developing offensively. And that is a major problem.
And I love that we came to that conclusion, because you mentioned something regarding whether or not Rutgers runs an offense. And I may not be a tenured former coach with the X's and O's experience. The one thing I am is certainly a litigator and an investigator and an attorney in that way. And I've picked up on Steve, some of his comments that seemed like throwaway little like comments. He said a few times, well, the guys like it here because the defense is this and the offense, they get to create, they get to kind of do their thing. And to me, that's indicative of the fact that, no one doesn't have anything to run ever, but it's very basic, it's very redundant, and it's kind of like, hey, once that falls apart, whatever you kind of create on offense, it kind of is to the wind. And to your point, I think that has been an issue, because when you load up on offensive firepower like they did last year, so they thought, and you don't know how to properly install an offense that's going to maximize, or on the other side, recruit players that fit certain roles in your offensive philosophy, but you just say, hey, we got a lot of offense. And now when the defense isn't working, you're really in trouble. And I think in order to attract the guys or build the team that we are talking about hypothetically here or going forward, where you have certain pillars of a defense and you go out and recruit them, you're going to need, both for marketing and retainment purposes and recruiting purposes, and for X's and O's purposes on the court to be successful, you're going to have to overhaul the coaching philosophies and maybe the coaching talent and strategy ability in the room to overhaul this offense. And then I would kind of spin that into this next point in this segue, which is, if that's the case, and I'm not sure that is entirely, but if that's the case, that we have woefully been underwhelming from a coaching perspective on the offensive side of the ball, and now we find ourselves in this space, a lot of that failure's got to be on Pikiell, and that is, in my opinion, a pretty bad offense, because when you were in the position to capitalize on great recruiting, you failed to, partially at least, because of your lack of offensive philosophy and direction in the building. And if that's the case, how long do you have to get back on track and capitalize before a new AD, a new president decide to move on? And in your opinion, how much of this is on Pikiell and how much of it involves offense, or it could be everything, recruiting, defense, everything. And how much longer does he have after these 2 bad years? I know he got us to a place we hadn't been in several decades. I get that. And I'm not saying that you switch it up and suddenly Rutgers is a contender, because we know we have a lot of issues here. But what I am wondering is, regardless of that, how much longer does he have with 2 really, really, really disappointing seasons, and maybe not the guy? I don't know. We have to give him some time to see if he can still be the guy to revamp the team in that way. I mean, how much longer does he have, and how much is on him for this?
Well, I mean, his contract goes through 2031, and they don't exactly have a lot of cash to pay him not to be there. And this sounds negative, but this is really a positive thing from what we've seen at Rutgers. Kind of the James Cratch to Chris Ash, like, just suck normal type of thing. If you look at Pikiell, right, they've never been an embarrassment, right? His first year, the biggest takeaway was that they just weren't embarrassing, right? And even the tough parts of 2 years ago, I know they had that nice win streak when Jeremiah Williams first came, back and whatever. But even when that kind of magic fell off, they were still not an embarrassment. They weren't winning games. But then they didn't have the horses. But that's a lot different than the Chris Ash era. Even like Kyle Flood blowing some of those games in 2015, like patheticness. Like, we're not at that level per se. So I think that will ride it a little bit. But when you say how much of it is his fault, well, the debate last year was, is it you brought the wrong players or the players don't fit your system? But really, you're kind of saying it's a third thing, which is, especially in offense, what is your system? Maybe your system's a problem. In any of those 3 scenarios, it ultimately rolls up to the head coach. And I think kind of what I said on one of our other podcasts, I think if Steve Pikiell is willing to make some changes, like you see a lot of times with football, how many times Jim Harbaugh could have been fired at Michigan, but he changes coordinators or changes his recruiting somehow. And these college football coaches survive because they have fall guys and they move this and that and the other thing. Pikiell, if he's too nice of a guy and is not going to have like a fall guy, cut bait, reorg type thing, he's not going to survive. Because they're like I said, Rutgers has hired 4 out of 5 coaches who are program builders at a lower level. There are plenty of guys in basketball that have coached, and you can look at them and say they can. It's different than football, where we're like, okay, if they get rid of Greg Schiano, you're completely rolling the dice with who would be the replacement. It's so hard to be sure with football with your head person. Whereas with basketball, high school basketball, college basketball, women's basketball, like at any level of basketball, it's easier to replace and roll through coaches and people, and if you need to, right? I mean, look at what Pikiell did with Eddie Jordan's players.
Yeah.
Same players. And they were like they like doubled the number of wins they had. Right? Yeah. So again, I'm not saying he's on the hot seat, but unless he makes changes, it's hard to see this improving. And that might be GM who says, okay, we're only going to give you guys who have enough physical ability to play defense in the Big Ten, right? Maybe that's it. Maybe they say you can't even go after these guys because, like, the PJ Hayes, he, no matter how good he is on offense, which he's not as good as we thought, but he's not playable defensively, right? Maybe you have a GM and that just kind of gives you your pool of guys, and then Pikiell's handshake and honesty allows him to make those inroads and make those relationships with those guys, or they come the money aspect, or you have different offensive coaches. I don't know. I don't think there's one way that he has to make changes. I'm saying only one way it will work, but there are changes that have to be made because there's nothing that's right now that says that gives us reason to believe this is organically going to improve. because the ingredients that were there for it to organically improve when he first arrived are no longer there.
Right.
And that's my concern.
Right.
Because I've never spoken to him, never interviewed him, nothing. But when you just look from the outsider perspective, and this is a fan podcast, really, you see that something has to change. And you hope that it's in the Pikiell regime. I don't want to hire another coach, but I also know that if they have to, there are plenty of people that could take the job and will want the job at Rutgers because it's in the Big Ten.
Right. And so money considerations, everything you just said. I mean, I don't know if we're going to have an ambitious AD, but I'm thinking that obviously we're going to have an ambitious AD. You're not an AD unless you're ambitious, but you know what I mean?
Sure.
I don't know if we're going to have somebody who's got a tighter leash or who's willing to have a longer leash with, guys like Pikiell. But what I'm saying is I'm wondering if when a GM type figure comes in, and I think it has been listed, we know it's a thing, it's going to happen. Is that person on the same page? And then do they now as kind of a team have 3 years to figure it out and get everything going to see if Pikiell has it? And even if that's the case, if in 2 years it looks like it's going to be an aborted takeoff again, how much time and space do they have to work this out? I do think that given and I might not have said this before you just made your comment. So this shows that, if you listen to people and you kind of process, you can come to different conclusions, which is healthy. I think that if you're going to have a GM who's going to assist in the personnel department and the spending department and the pool of talent department, you've got to give a guy who has shown previously the ability to flat out coach, even if that is more of a defensive minded coaching. It worked at some point. If you got a guy who can flat out coach, and maybe you're looking at the serious possibility, and I think it's probably more likely than not that personnel has maybe been the issue here overall the last couple of years, just looking at it. You got to give him a chance to coach with better personnel decisions and strategy. And I think that probably looks like at least 2 years. I don't know if that's the case because I don't know how this AD might have his eye on somebody already. And in which case, if we have another blunder this year, or maybe he doesn't, but the blunder is so bad that it's just like you can't survive it. I don't know. But I think Pikiell has some chance for certain to show that he can get this right with the new setup in the athletic department and learning from some mistakes. And time will tell. Am I confident necessarily? I don't know. I don't want to count the guy out. The guy's given me so many memories. He's such a fiery guy. I loved his hard-nosed Northeastern style coming in. He gave me a lot of great memories. He built something that we thought would have been pretty tough to build. And he also squandered something that I think we thought would have been pretty tough to squander. So I kind of at 0.0 with him right now. I'm not super confident, but I'm not willing to just count him out. So I think we'll see, but I think the window is a little limited, but not necessarily his seat's on fire, come this season. We'll see.
I mean, if you play the timeline out, right? Okay. So it's going to be too cost prohibitive to pay. Like Rutgers doesn't have the money, right? He's going to get at least it's either 2 or 3 more years at least. If they're terrible for 2 years, okay, I could see a move being made. If they have one terrible year, but show signs the other year of the next 2, you're going to get 3. In the past, a big issue was you didn't want to coach with less than 4 years left on their deal because in recruiting, you had to sell players on, hey, this will be your coach for your 4 years. That's very important. It will always be important for parents. But now in the transfer portal era, they're going to say, well, we're just going to transfer anyway. So I don't think you have to worry about that 4-year on your contract clock for being like a lame duck like you used to be. It had to be 3 or 4 years, right? So that's out the window. So, but really it's 2 or 3. So I think if you get to 2028, 2029, then that's when this is going to be a decision that have to be made. This new AD is going to come in. They're not even there for this full year, right? So they can't really, you're going to have to keep, volleyball is terrible for years, but they're not going to fire their coach like 2 weeks before the season, right? Like if this AD comes in, conducts their interviews, even if the AD was hired today, they're going to interview all the coaches in the next, 2-3 weeks. volleyball season starts in August, so that's not happening, right? And you look at some of the other programs, like tennis had a down year. Pretty much everyone was down. Softball, maybe they're looking to make a change. These are higher priorities for the athletic department than a coach who has proven it already in Steve Pikiell. So this year, completely off the table. The first you would even consider it would be a year from now. And then after you make some of these other changes, you start thinking about what a succession plan would be in a worst case scenario, which at least gives the following season. So now we're into end of 2027, likely end of 2028. And then if no progress is made, then maybe you make a change. But he's got time, which is why that's what concerns me is like, now's the time to start making a major change. Don't wait for the 11th hour to do that, right? You have time. If it doesn't work, try again next year, And now that we're on these 1 or 2 we talked about in an earlier podcast, how long can you logically plan ahead? You can't not look at 2 years. You can't just look at 1 year. But 2 years beyond that is like, who knows what's going to happen? And so that's kind of like when I play this out in my mind, it's like 2 or 3 more years at least. And then that's really probably when a decision is going to be made, barring obviously scandal, which is, I don't think Steve Pikiell is going to get in a scandal, but that or just be so terrible that they're getting no revenue and people aren't showing up to the rack. As long as people show up to the rack and there's a chance Rutgers can go into most games with a chance of winning, then I think he'll just keep going for a couple more years. And then there's other priorities.
Interesting. I mean, I'm not as convinced, to be honest with you. I think a new regime, a new AD, a new president, if he can raise some money to replace him, it might be earlier if he needs to. I'm not saying it won't be 3 years. I'm not so convinced it's definitely 2 or 3 years, but we will certainly see. I think we explored quite well without going crazy in any one thing here, what our general outlook is for Steve Pikiell one way or another. And I think regardless of what the timeline is or what the specific reasons are, he's got to make some adjustments. He's got to implement some things, and it's got to start right now. I think we all knew that. No one's surprised about that. But I'm glad we got to shed some light, especially on where defense failed, where some of the personnel things failed, and some of the nuts and bolts of everything here. I think it is something to discuss in the offseason and the dog days of summer. So any final thoughts on Pikiell and basketball or anything else? We'll be back with him soon with, embracing the future. And we have some other things in the works with what ifs and Big Ten conversation with other guests. But for now, any other thoughts?
I mean, his buyout goes down by $2 million a year every year. So that's kind of always going to be a factor. But the main thing I just want to say, and to anyone in the basketball department, athletics department who's listening to this podcast and is taking this as like very heavy criticism, there's nothing I want more than Rutgers teams to win, except maybe against Penn in basketball. But other than that, I want you to be the second best team in the country, right? It's like, I've been a fan of Rutgers since I was a child. I was here long before anyone in the athletic department started being involved. I don't want them to fail. Okay. I'm not even going to root for them to have a bad season to make a change, which some people do. Like in the NBA, I'm not rooting for, like in the NBA, sometimes you root for your team to tank so they get a better draft pick. No, I don't want that at all. I'm like you. I want them to win. I want the best for that program and the kids in that program, the people who were in the program before. So any of this criticism is not intended even for clickbait. It's honestly, I want the team to do better. And I was a fan before this regime was here. I will be a fan long after they're gone, no matter what happens. But ultimately, I know that there's money involved and there's egos involved and there's personalities involved and you're dealing with 18 to 20-year-old kids. I'm not saying it's easy, but that's what makes it worth watching. That's why we've followed it, in my case, my entire life, going to games, for Rutgers basketball. And I hope that just a couple of these minor changes on the margin, a little bit of luck, and Rutgers is back, on the NCAA tournament bubble like they have been before.
I think we all can agree on that. And guys, if you're listening, we are 100% behind you. It just comes with the territory that there's going to be some discussion, especially after the year we had last year and the year before. But to all the Night Watch listeners out there, thank you for joining us once again. We will be back with more special episodes, and our regular coverage will, of course, commence upon football season getting here. And we will continue to cover Rutgers athletics. If you have not yet subscribed, click the subscribe button. If you're listening on the audio podcast, come on over to YouTube, subscribe. And YouTube listeners, remember, in your car, at work, we're available on every major podcast platform, so check it out. And if you want to help out, be a little bit of a sponsor there, click the join button, become a member of the channel, and there are many perks, including some written stuff, to come. So we will see you guys very soon. We appreciate you listening. We hope you are enjoying the summer. Get out, get in the pool, stay cool, and we'll be with you soon. Go Knights. Larry K. and Dave Anderson are out.